Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Kara Carmack. I'm the Assistant Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs at the New York Studio School. And I'm honored to welcome you to our final event of the Fall 2024 Evening Lecture Series. We're beyond thrilled to welcome four distinguished artists to speak about the life and work of their longtime friend, Pat de Groot, whose work is currently the subject of an exhibition, Pat de Groot, Sea Smoke, currently on view at the New York Studio School through January 20th, 2025. And behind me is a sneak peek at the exhibition. For this evening's program, we'll reserve time at the end for Q&A with the audience. So please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address those at the end. The New York Studio School is grateful to the following funders for their support of the 2024-25 Evening Lecture Series: the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and many generous individual contributors. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists this evening, and I'll just be going in alphabetical order. Richard Baker grew up in a steelworking family in Baltimore, Maryland. After high school, he attended the Maryland Institute College of Art, moving to Boston to complete his studies at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. After graduating, he worked at a Harvard Square bookstore for several years while painting nights and weekends in a waterfront loft. He then spent a year building poolside sculptures for an artist gallerist in Palm Beach, Florida. After that, for a number of years, he managed a seasonal clothing store, earning enough money each summer to devote himself exclusively to painting through the winter in a shuttered town at the end of Cape Cod, which I assume is Provincetown, which I assume is where you met Pat. The next 25 years were spent in New York, painting, exhibiting there and elsewhere, raising two children, and teaching in New Jersey at Rutgers University. He now lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and is dedicated exclusively to daily work in his studio. Paul Bowen came to the US from Wales in 1972 as a graduate student, also at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, where he worked with Sal Scarpita, Grace Hartigan, and Ed Dugmore. In 1977, he moved to Provincetown to be a fellow at the Fine Art Work Center. He stayed in Provincetown for 30 years, making sculpture, prints, and drawings related to the waterfront. His move to Cape Cod brought him in contact with the flourishing community of artists and writers, including none other than Pat de Groot. Soon after, they began a friendship that lasted many years. Georgia Marsh is a painter living and working in New York City. In the early 80s, she started to spend summers in Provincetown while teaching at the School for Visual Arts and NYU. She moved into Pat's house in 1989, spending summers and much of the fall with her until 1999. After that, she spent every Christmas and birthday with Pat until her death. Marsh has shown her work extensively in New York, Paris, Milan, Houston, and Rhode Island. Her work is in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the RISD Museum in Providence, Rhode Island, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the New York Public Library, among others. Helen Miranda Wilson is a painter who, after living for decades in New York City, now makes her home in Wellfleet, Massachusetts. She attended the New York Studio School from 1969 to 1971 and met Pat in Provincetown in 1974 at the young age of 17. No?
No.
You're correcting, please correct me.
1965.
Oh, 1965, sorry about that, typo. At the age of 17, which marked the beginning of a lifelong friendship. Wilson's work is in the collection of the De Cordova Sculpture Park and Museum in Lincoln, Massachusetts, the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C., the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York, and the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, among others. She's represented by Bookstein Projects here in New York. So thanks to the four of you for being here with us this evening to discuss the work of the remarkable Pat de Groot. Some of your intros hinted at how you knew Pat, and I wonder if you might start us off by elaborating on how you first met her and the shape of your friendship over the years while I share my screen with everyone.
Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. Yeah, I met Pat when I was 17. I walked into her house in Provincetown. I should add that I grew up in Wellfleet, 2 towns over. My parents lived there year-round. And I walked in, it was the end of a late afternoon, and I saw more people with black and brown skin in her big room. It was all an open space in that house, which she designed herself for her husband and herself. There were more black people, brown-skinned people in that room than I'd ever seen together on the Outer Cape, which is a very white place. It's less so now. But the atmosphere was so friendly and so alive. And Pat had cooked this amazing meal. And we sat down, there must have been 12, 13, 14 of us. And it was delicious food. There was delicious food. I hadn't ever met Pat before that. And I had arrived there tracking down a boyfriend. I'd been away for a while, and he was there living in the house there and doing odd jobs. And I got to say, just to give you some sense, I had my first joint that night. And then we went upstairs to where he was staying and had a great time together. And I'm mentioning something that personal because it tells you what kind of household that was. At that time, Bob Thompson, I think, was around. I can't remember if he ever stayed there, but black painter, and he now has a show on in New York, by the way. A friend of mine just saw Pat's show and his show. So Pat and I got to be friends, spending more time or less time together over the years, and finally, steadily, a great deal of time. I only spent a few nights there because I had a home in Wellfleet. Started paintings there once when I came up in winter and my house was closed. But she and I couldn't have been more different. And out of that difference, we loved each other. And she is a great loss to me now, not being able to visit her, not being able to be with her. I had a steady relationship with her that was perhaps in some ways less intimate than, I'm just guessing at this, the other people on the panel, because as I said, we were very different and we were very steady and we were very much in communication. And when she had the incredible courage to start using oil paints, which she did after years of, in a Buddhist tradition, drawing from life, drawing the birds from life. First seagulls, she'd kayak across the harbor, which is a long ways, and spend the day there drawing seagulls with a stick and ink. Later, she did ducks, and after the breakwater was built, she did cormorants. Maybe she did the ducks and cormorants, at different times when they showed up seasonally. But this grid is an example of all the grids she did over many years, and she'd do showing at Long Point Gallery. There'd be one of these. And if you look at the size of each drawing, the grid would take up, top to bottom, a huge wall, and was extraordinarily beautiful. I guess the last thing I want to say about her is the whole time I knew her, she had an edge. She came out of a situation which had darkness and perhaps lack of kindness, very privileged, and she broke away from it. And the whole time I knew her, starting at 17 until the day she died, she came away from that and, okay, I'm going to say this, went towards the light. She didn't make a big thing about her spiritual practice, her Buddhism, but she had a shrine in her room, and she really walked the walk with it. She really undid more and more darkness, undid more and more of the negative stuff in her life. And she still would have flashes of it, but being with her and being part of her life in art, which is different than all the pictures she would make, the drawings, was an extraordinary thing for me. She gave me many gifts, and having hope about my own life is one of them. Also, just quickly, she was an extraordinary cook. She could grow anything. She had an incredible garden, and her life with animals was right at the center of everything. Her animals were as important to her as her art, and she was one of the least careerist people I've ever met in my life. I guess that's it.
Thanks, Helen. Paul?
Yes, thanks, Helen. That was great. So this is how I remember meeting Pat for the first time. I had heard about her, and there was already a sort of buzz about this person, though I didn't really know anything about. And I'm sure I knew that sooner or later I'd be meeting her. Provincetown's a small enough place, especially for year-round community. I was already living there year-round, and she had been there for many, many years before that. So I arrived in Provincetown in fall of 1977, and I was just started making sculpture. Been making sculpture for a couple of years, and right away I started walking the beach collecting materials to make things out of. And one day, with just a little bit of beach, the tide was mostly in, but I was already kind of a fanatic about collecting things. I started walking east from where we were living at the Fine Arts Work Zone on Pearl Street. And I eventually came to a spot where to go further, I'd had to be wading. And there was a house that had a double peaked roof, which is very unusual there. And it had a big deck and bulkhead in front and a table. And at that table, there was this figure standing, clearly drawing. And so I must have heard that she drew birds at that time. And so I kind of backed away, not wanting to. Oh, that's great to see that photograph. That's exactly, it's so exactly right. And I think she was drawing at that table, probably with a stick or bamboo pen, but she called the bamboo pen a stick anyway. And in the winter, you can see she's got like a weatherproof coat on and a hat. The ducks come into very shallow water and puddle around, I guess, kicking up worms and whatever they can find, and that stuff floats to the surface. They gobble it up, and they dip down in the water and hang out together as a group. And Pat was there. The tide, as we see in that photograph, there was on that day was further in. But what I see looking at that is there's a pot of ink. And when the weather got really cold, the ink in like black India ink would freeze. And so to stop that, she had I'm not sure what it was, like a little what are those little I don't know what you call it, little candles that you use to keep food warm, like at
She
a
called it like
dinner.
a sterno heater.
Yes, yes, like a sterno thing to keep the ink from freezing. And that sort of tells me so much about her, that level of commitment, like drawing in a kayak, for instance, you know, obviously not the easiest thing to do in the whole world. Drawing out on the deck like that in bitterly, bitterly cold weather. And so anyway, I concluded that that figure standing on the deck drawing was indeed the Pat de Groot. And I kind of backed off, not wanting to get in the way. She probably would have been pretty grumpy that anyone was getting that closer while she was working. And so I split, and I don't remember when, but shortly after we really met, and that was really the beginning of a very, very long friendship. And so many stories and things. But something seeing all these drawings makes me remember how on the second floor of her house there was a room that was kind of like a workroom, but it was also storage, where there were stacks of sketchbooks. I don't know what the measurements were. They were quite big, bigger than 11 by 14, but anyway, large. And there were hundreds and hundreds of drawings. I mean, stacks like at least knee high and maybe more. And it became one of those things like a saying out of a Pinter play that one of these days I'm going to get to those drawings. And indeed, she made groups of drawings to exhibit together, but there were hundreds and hundreds more. And I still think about those and what the future holds for them. So I think I'll stop there and maybe chime in later. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Georgia, do you want to follow?
I met Pat because I'm walking down the streets in Provincetown. I noticed her crazy garden through the fence. It was wild, it was full of weeds, and it was also full of produce, lettuce, and all the kinds of things, and flowers. And I always just checked in and looked at that garden. And then one year I needed a place to stay, and I saw there was a for rent sign, and I walked in, and that's where I met Pat. I stayed upstairs in the apartment up there for so many years I can't count.
I kind of came late, much later to meeting Pat, in very different circumstances. I was rather young, not as young as Helen when she met Pat, in my 20s perhaps, I think. And I was new to Provincetown, kind of a bit of an innocent at that point. And standing in line, I think it must have been at the health food store. I'm not exactly sure, but I was standing in line waiting to pay for something. And this woman behind me with gray hair and a kind of gravelly voice came up to me and said, hey, are you Richard Baker? And I was like, yeah. And so it was kind of, disarmed. And she had seen a small painting of mine on a group show at the museum. And said, I like that painting. And I said, no, that wasn't my painting. That was Jim Peters' paintings. I mean, I kind of deflected on somebody else. It couldn't possibly have been my painting. So she said, yeah, it was your painting. And where are you working? Where do you have a studio? And I was sharing a small bedroom studio with someone. And I told her that. She said, do you need a studio? I said, well, yeah. And she offered me her second floor studio off season to work in the studio. I worked there in exchange for work in the garden, things around the house. And so I thought, this is really weird, but I could really use the studio. And so that's when we met. And what happened was that I quickly found found that I could do things that I didn't know I could do. Every year there'd be this cry from off of her deck about the seaweed, a certain kind of seaweed is in, and we'd have to go and gather tons of seaweeds and put it in the garden, build a new bed. There'd be another cry that the manure truck had arrived, and we had to, seed the garden with the manure. And so there were all these waves of things, these things to do, rebuilding her clematis trellis in front of her gate. There was no lack of work to do, but the benefit of doing all of that work wasn't simply being able to have a studio, but it was having a magnificent studio looking over the bay, the same view that Pat had in her work that I wasn't really using myself, but I was able to enjoy it. And but her generosity, which was mentioned earlier, was something that was kind of profound to me. Pat liked to kind of, I can't quite say be amused, but I think Pat really got a charge out of being able to spur other artists on. I think that her generosity was kind of in.
Yes, she did.
Yeah, it was moral. It was inspiring. And in my case, I mean, she actually did some extraordinarily generous things, like and some funny things. So one year I was painting a lot of tulips, and one year she, unbeknownst to me, had planted like 100 tulip bulbs in her garden of all varieties, like these French fancy tulips, black tulips, kind of tulips I'd never seen before anywhere. And that kind of fueled her passion for her own art. She would find, I was painting fish a lot, and she would find a gill net, which she actually detested. She would be in her kayak and she'd find a gill net, and she would take as many mackerel out of the gill net as she could to bring home for me to paint. There's one day when I heard the back screen door slam shut so hard, it like shook me out of my chair. And Pat ran out to the beach yelling my name, and she was wrestling a blackback seagull who had caught a fish, a sea bass, some large fish, and she wrestled the fish out of the bird's mouth, brought it to me, and said, "Here, you paint this, and we'll eat it later." And Paul, you're part of this story because I was so I'm painting this fish up in the cold second floor studio, bundled up, and it's a dead fish, and I'm painting it, and then all of a sudden the thing starts flopping and then flops off the table onto the floor, and I'm like, "Oh, gee, it's not dead." And then so I pick it up, put it back on, because I thought, it's almost dead. But that happened several times, and Paul came around to visit Pat, and I was like, "Paul, you got to help me," because Paul knew how to fish, and I knew nothing about fishing. And so Paul came up and put the poor thing out of its misery. And then after I painted it, Pat actually cooked it, speaking of being a good cook. But it was that kind of, generosity and animation and involvement in passionate involvement in other artists' lives that I think really helped fuel her too. Yeah. So that's pretty much my
She always did that. When I would go out to draw or to paint, she would always have dinner ready for me when I came home. So I didn't have to cook. She said, "You just keep working, work until it's dark. Don't worry about it." And she would always make dinner for me. It was wonderful.
That's so great. You remember she would have cats that went out on the flats at low tide, and they would go fishing. And they would come home frequently with squid. I remember that. And somehow that was sort of, and Richard painted squid. Oh, wait a minute. Richard, this is something that I think the first thing I noticed about you was you, on one occasion, painted a rubber squid. Right?
Yes, it was a lure. It was used as fake
wow,
bait.
What an interesting take on the fact that there's, in the summer sometimes the harbor is totally full of squid, and there you are painting a rubber squid, and that really sort of said a lot about you know, your sensibility and all of that. But
I
her
got it.
cats
I
out
got
there
it at Marine
fishing.
Supply.
What?
I got the squid lure at Marine Supply.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Right.
I want to say
Yeah.
more about the animals. So when I met Pat, remember a very long time ago, she had a family of black and white cats. Richard at one point took care of one of the generations. And there was a mother cat called Pippin. And Pippin, Paul, was the one that fished, you know, right there in the harbor. The others, not so much. There were three offspring of Pippin, also black and white, and some of them were smarter than others, let's put it that way. And they all had, a lot of them had double paws, and they frequented the house, but it was only cats. And then this huge thing happened. At a certain point, and I wish I could pinpoint the age, she got a German Shepherd puppy that she was convinced had some wolf lineage. Maybe it did. She did. And that dog was called a Tisha. And it was a huge change because dogs go out in the world with her. Went out in the world with her. They weren't just leading their cat lives, which are, you know, cats are very independent and they stayed around the house. Pat even went on a camping trip with a Tisha way the hell up into Canada. And she didn't like go to only campsites. She went to places where nobody else was and was up there for weeks, which I need to change the subject for animals for 1 minute. She had two other dogs like that, rehabilitating one, but she also went to Tibet and she was there for weeks or even over a month hiking in the Himalayas. And was very independent like that. And also, none of us have mentioned, very, very athletic, particularly when she was young. And during the time I met her as a teenager and later, she got a second-degree black belt. There was a very good kind of special dojo in Provincetown. She had a whole kind of guru thing with the person whose dojo it was. And she was spare, she was short, she was like a bird in her athleticism. She was so taut and kind of, I mean, she skied. Remember, I knew her when she was younger. When she was old, she got very infirm. She had Lyme disease and stuff. But when she was very young, and we talked about this quite a bit, she rode horses a lot and did it in a way that most people don't do it. She didn't show, but she rode horses. She jumped a lot. I got very specific with her about it because I liked horses too. And to think about her without thinking about how she grew things, and her life with animals is to leave out a whole part really of her life in art, because remember, she wasn't like a careerist artist. She wanted to show the work, but it wasn't like that. She didn't want to move to New York and get a gallery. She wanted to do it, and then out of that came, you know, putting the grid up of the birds every year, and being able to really look at it out of her studio. I don't know. I don't know what the experience of the rest of you was in terms of her life in art and wanting to be known as an artist and recognized. But I never heard her say one competitive, you know, resentful thing. And George's story of being supported is spot on. You know, she really cared about helping and nurturing other people be that. And that's how she was with her husband. They were only together, what, 5 years, and then he died.
Mm. whilst those photographs are up there, it's well worth mentioning that if you can't read the text, which is really small for me here, the tuna on the left is a bluefin, giant bluefin tuna, which she caught aboard Charlie Mayo's boat. And on the right is her in 1983 in her kayak with this orca who just appeared one summer. It says here 1983. And it was kind of spooky. The orca really seemed to like people and have had some prior experience of being around people. But so Pat, absolutely fearless, paddled out there in her kayak to be with the orca. I don't think she did any drawings of it, did she? I don't. Not that I'm aware of, but
Not a
anyway.
series, not a series, but I saw at least a couple. They
Did she?
weren't, you know, they weren't like the birds.
No.
The orca wasn't like the birds. It was half underwater, but I remember seeing one or two.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Do any of you remember how she used to draw bird drawings on stones?
Oh, yes, of course.
Right,
Yes.
of course. That's right.
I've got a bunch of them, and you know, she'd just give them to us. I mean, I'm sure you guys all had some at some point. And she'd find she'd find the bird's shape and the shape of the stone.
Helen, you mentioned her husband, Nanno, and I know he remained a presence for her throughout her whole life, but in my conversations with the four of you too, her art practice is in many ways tethered to Nanno and his work as a painter. And I wonder if you might give us some background into that relationship and his work and how you see her work sort of progressing out of Nanno's death in some ways.
I do know one thing, which is that she was designing books. She had studied with a very famous book designer and did that to support them. But she, I think I know this, she only started the drawings after his death. He had cancer. It was heartbreaking. She cared for him hand and foot until he died. And she kind of hit bottom. And at a certain point after that, you know, her life became somewhat chaotic and wild. And then she went to a Buddhist, oh God, what do you call them? You know, a spiritual place of, not a monastery. It's, you know, anyway.
Ashram.
Thank you, an ashram, sorry. And lived there for a bit. Anybody correct me if I'm wrong. And then came out of it. And during that period is when I met her. I met her not really long after Nanno died. But to get back to Kara's question, she had some of Nanno's paints around for years. And she was drawing and drawing and drawing. And a devout practice. The stacks of drawings, Paul, says it all, you know, daily. But she said to me that when she started oil painting, she hadn't done it and she was not scared of it, but there was some thing that kept her from doing it because they were Nannos. And her crossing that line, I referred to it earlier as being brave. And, you know, I should only be so lucky to be so brave. Maybe I have to do that right now as a matter of fact, my own life, in terms of being an artist, that you become your own self when you've been connected to someone who was another artist, very intense artist. And God, I never met him, but I want to describe one more thing she told me about. I said, so how did you meet Nanno? She said, well, one day he was around, she said. One day I was sitting on the top of one of those piling, big like things for docks that have, it's a huge tree trunk and it has the top squared off, and she was perched on top of it like a bird. She didn't say like a bird, but, sort of crouched, and Nanno came by, and that's when they connected. I love that description.
I think it's funny that the mentioning of Nanno's paints and Pat's hesitation in using those paints. I think it had less to do with, say, a fear of the paint itself as much as a reverence for Nanno. I mean, as we all know, her reverence and support of other artists runs pretty deep. And I mean, she even once wrote a letter to me in 2002 that said something about not having considered herself as an artist, but she just got a gallery and she sort of felt like she now had joined us, right? Which is weird, kind of weird. Like, I mean, because that non-careerist thing, right? But her relationship to Nanno's paints was not so much about the fear of his paints or any kind of like residue of him. It had to do with her reverence of him as a painter and her support of him as a painter and his creative mind. So she couldn't consider herself an oil painter until she began to use the paint as a drawing implement. She was using the end of the tube. She was actually squeezing the paint out as a drawing implement. So her way into oil painting was through basically the bamboo stick, the pen, but at the end of a tube. It was just that way that the paint came out of the tube on the paper, these marks. So it kind of was irrelevant that it was oil, but for her, it was a big bridge between seeing Nanno as this amazing oil painter and her ability to use oil. So they're pretty. I mean, the one on the top left is amazing. I mean, it's really it's very related actually to her later work with the horizon. The way that she marks the page describing light playing on water. It's amazing the way she used the palette knife later. It's very similar to that. Yeah, there. It's, the piece in the center, especially.
She always used the knife. She never used brushes on her paintings.
Yeah.
Not even the extremely delicate fog ones, like the one you see on the right there, the one from 2000. I think it's called Whiteout. That's all palette knife. They're really, the delicacy and the finesse that she arrived at is really extraordinary with such a blunt tool.
She was very picky about being exactly the right kind of knife too.
Yes, I would imagine.
Yeah.
The thing
she really thought of Nanno as a giant, there was that sort of reverence for him and for his painting.
Was it that, or was it the thing where you have artist couples and they both take their place in relation to each other? Yeah, I mean, reverence, his energy, his, audacity, but she also was very strong. And I lost a partner of many years who was an artist about 7 years ago. And I found that the vacuum left by the fact that he's gone has me sort of swelling into the part of our life that he inhabited. It wasn't that I, turned him into some kind of, diva. In fact, we had a no diva rule. But Pat was, she designed this house that was so much the center of her life and all our lives, if, from what I'm hearing and from what I know anyway. And she designed it. And she designed it with a big studio for him and an area for her to work and so forth. That place that Paul described upstairs, she would do her like whatever she did on paper up there. And then he died. But at one point he didn't like something slightly, and she described to me how she was so angry that she smashed a window. Right, the house was, in the process of being, and just went off in a fury.
Right.
She wasn't like an acolyte. I didn't get that from what she said about reverence, but it was more, she wasn't like one of Picasso's women. You know what I mean?
Not at all. No.
Yeah, I mean, she had this burning kind of center to herself with him. It was a male-female thing for her, very stylized.
I think going back, I think putting the pieces together, I think going back to the idea that the whole artist couple thing I get, but and I don't think that one thing excludes another. I think that she's very strong, very feisty, very centered. But I think one of the things that she going back to this point, one of the things that fueled her was the ability to fuel another artist. So I think the reverence was not quite reverence, but it was actually the way that she liked. There was an energy about giving and about supporting. I mean, she was
participatory.
Yes, and she was very proud. She told me from very early on, she was very proud of being the person who bought Nanno's paint. And that's not just about reverence. That's about supply. It's about that's about fueling. It's about giving you a meal. It's about having all of us over for dinner. It's about giving studios for free to other artists. I mean, and so I think that thing with Nanno wasn't exactly so. I mean, of course, there must have been some kind of gendered element to it, but I think that giving her feistiness and her strength, her ability to leave her family of opportunity to become an independent woman doing her own thing. I think all of that speaks to that to not being a traditional gendered relationship. I think that she carved out her own.
I think Pat was a great lover. She really loved as a verb. And part of that loving was providing and supplying and nurturing and giving. And when she really loved someone, which I certainly know she did with you, Richard, she gave everything she had. She would wrestle a bird for the fish to give it to you. She would do anything for her friends and the people that she admired. And I'm sure that was it, even more so with Nanno, because she was in love with him.
Yeah, exactly.
And they had sex. I mean, sex was a huge thing for her. Can we talk about music? Because she played out with somebody that was a professional band that did steel drums and dance music, and drummed with friends of mine who were musicians, and she had the most extraordinary collection of records. And at the time I met her, when I walked into the house and there were so many people of color, again, very unusual on the Outer Cape at that time or any time, she had a relationship with an extraordinary drummer called Elvin Jones, who was, deified, and rightly so, jazz drummer, and played with Miles Davis, with all the greats, a lot of the greats. And she was in that world and entranced by music. I remember she played me this incredible record of pygmy songs or music, and my hair stood on end. And so I'm tagging on to the thing of, of her being a muse for other people. But it also had a little bit of a controlling thing, so that she'd want to drench you with that kind of love, and it was real, and it helped, and it was extraordinary, but it also could take you over. That did not happen with me. I was, once again, very independent. I had my own situation 2 towns away and was regular with her, but she could never completely take me in because I had my family, my parents, and so forth very close by. But I remember hearing from, I don't want to say some of you, it's not my story to tell yours, but from people that she had that kind of attachment with, who would say, it's so much, it gives me so much, but it's overwhelming sometimes. I don't want to deify her because she was so extraordinary. You know, she had such an energy. It made me want to paint more, even though I was painting way before she was. It was something that I wanted to be close to, like you want to be close to her wood stove on a cold day.
You know, going back, so I hope this is not too much of a break in the flow of the conversation, but going back to her relationship with animals, you know, you're mentioning the wood stove. She gave so much room to her animals, and her record collection all smelled like cat pee, as we all know, because she just it was their domain. So I have one funny story to tell about that wood stove. I'm standing next to the wood stove in the winter talking to Pat, and all of a sudden there's a leak that busts up open in the ceiling above the wood stove, and then this water comes rushing down, hits the wood stove, and smells so foul. And Pat at that very instant goes, "Pippin!" and runs upstairs because Pippin had heard her voice and decided to pee through the floor to hit Pat.
Oh, God.
Yeah. So it was a very complicated relationship. So.
And she wouldn't, let's put it this way, her male cats were very often intact.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. And they would come home like after like major scuffles, and she would tend to them, feed them like really fancy meat, and just try to nurse them back to health. So
This is really all about her art at the same time. That's what, it's my pretentious phrase, life and art. She wasn't trying to act like an artist. It was from the inside out. So all these other things that she chose to have in her life, very different than her background, were very, very engrossing when you were close to her. I think that I want to mention somebody in my life for a variety of reasons was the publisher Roger Strauss, who was a very elegant, very successful head of Farrar Straus Giroux, the publishing house. And Pat was a cousin of his. And Pat was his favorite cousin. She led such a different life, but that says a lot because Roger had an incredibly large, sophisticated array of people, endless, fascinating people that he knew, published, was friends with, slept with, I don't know. But Pat was his favorite cousin. He always asked after her and cared very much for her.
Pat has a very interesting family background.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, should we go there?
Well,
Yeah.
that picture of her and her mother, is it somehow accessible? Yeah. So her mother was a New York socialite, very fancy. And her mother was like the person who helped Truman Capote organize the black and white ball. So it says something about Pat. Pat told me a bit about her, and some of the stories she told me made my hair stand on end.
Mm-hmm.
And Pat getting out of there was really good.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't sit there and live a life of a cripple. She really got out and did it.
Yeah, she got out to the degree that she wasn't like a trust fund baby. I mean, she really severed ties. She got very little from the family.
Oh, and you know why? So she was a trust fund baby. I mean, they were very wealthy. And when she started, according to her, quote unquote, hanging out with Black people, that is when they restricted her access to the money that she'd inherited. in the trust.
Right. Yeah, I remember every year she used to have to go to, I can't remember who the guy was, what his name was, but every year she had to go see the executor of the trust fund and beg.
Right.
And there wasn't like, it was not like a lot of money. So
it wasn't. When she needed to get the roof fixed, she had to, you know, special request. You know, it was a pain for her, you know, to have the roof repaired, which was a big deal because, as we all remembered, sometimes the roof leaked.
Oh, yes.
It wasn't just Pippin coming down through the
yeah.
Yeah.
God.
You know, and irony about that also is that she had a much beloved nanny who was black when she was a young child, who she absolutely adored. I don't remember her name, but Pat would talk about her sometimes. And I think that woman was more family to her than her family was, than her blood family was.
As was so often the case with people that would have a nanny. She told me about her father, who was, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, Welsh. He was English or Welsh?
Maybe. I'm not sure. The name is
Anyway,
Richardson, right?
yeah, Richardson. And, you know, she didn't grow up with him and her mother in the same household, really, but she knew him and he was, you know, very attractive. I've seen pictures of him, not many, and very athletic and very important to her. The other thing that, for people that are listening and don't know about this, she grew up in England,
Right.
and then was sent here because of the war. You know, during
That's right.
the Blitz, there were kids that were sent here.
Yeah, oh, yes. Many kids were sent here and to Canada. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I miss her. I know this is a panel at the studio school. I've been there and done that. And I went there and I should be more professional, but
Pat wouldn't want that.
her,
Not
one
at
of the
all.
beautiful things about this panel is that all four of us are artists. And with great respect for people who think and write about art and curators who curate shows, having four artists, all of whom do incredible work. I mean, besides me, okay, right now, I don't know how incredible my work is right now, if it exists at all, but just centered around her at the moment, talking about her and having had her in our lives. She's still very central to my life as an artist. I look at paintings of hers I have, I look at things she gave me. I look at pictures of her animals that she gave me. And hey, you know, none of us has brought up chocolate. What's wrong with us? How could we not have brought up chocolate? I mean, she pervaded, you know, the first one would be free. And at a certain point, now that she said, I can say this, she also at a certain point was a purveyor very carefully of drugs. And then she stopped doing that. She never, I mean, I'm sure she partook a little bit, but she wasn't an addict. She didn't use drugs like that. But she did that for a while.
Well, let's also talk about that. She always used to have a very fancy bottle of Armagnac. If you went over and you were sitting there eating the daikon.
At 10 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah. Well,
10 o'clock in the morning?
Oh, yeah. She'd come out with the Calvados.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, the Calvados. Well,
it was winter.
Para William, right? Also?
No, it was Calvados.
And then, shall we talk about the margaritas now? But Pat wasn't a drunk. I mean, she ate vegetables and macrobiotic, and, you know, she was not kind of whole hog macrobiotic, but she didn't drink every night at all. But she could party. She could have, you know, fun. And these people are all dead. But I remember some birthday parties, like some of hers that Georgia was at. And she used to give birthday parties for Myron Stout, the artist Myron Stout, and they were amazing. And the food would be great, and there would be...
And Stanley Kunitz, too.
Oh, I never went to one of those. That's
Yeah.
it. Well, I didn't know Stanley Kunitz. I knew Myron.
Yeah.
And Myron lived year-round in Provincetown, and she was very close with him.
Yeah.
Oh, and the other thing was, like, this house was amazing. You'd walk in, big space, just lots of people's paintings all over the wall, her paintings in her studio. But every year at the Fine Arts Work Center, which operates from October through May, I think, through May, she would have the fellows come over to her house. She'd have like a kind of evening for them, even though, you know, she was on the board of the Fine Arts Work Center and influential in getting people of color, you know, getting the center to do outreach to people of color to come as fellows. She was very aggressive about that. John Scoyles is on this, and he could probably speak to that because he was the director for a while and worked.
She was the president for quite a while of the Work Center.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Mm.
Yes, she was.
I have to say, looking at those two paintings, how much I miss seeing those paintings on a daily basis in the studio where you could just sort of walk in and out. And that was, you know, really helpful to me. And they still are, but I have to say, seeing those two particular ones right there, they're really extraordinary paintings.
They're very moving, and they're very unlike Pat, which is extraordinary. You would have no idea from looking at her paintings who she was as a character or as a person.
No.
But going back to her, you know, her Buddhist connection to things. I mean, she was like, you know, it's a living connection to her experience, and her experience was, you know, when she went to Tibet, you know, Nepal, I set her house that summer, and her bed sits so high up on the second floor that when you wake up, all you see is that, no ground. There's nothing. You see no ground. You see that.
Right.
You see, you can't see sand. You see the horizon, and you see whatever weather is going on, and that's it. And that's what she woke up to every day, and went to sleep to every night. The sounds, the smells, the beauty of that simplicity, and the ever-changing. It's never the same twice. It's similar, but never the same twice. I mean, and it really does speak to her living connection to experience, whether it's ducks or orcas or cat dogs or whatever, or the landscape. You know, that's Pat.
I can just hear her saying something appreciative, but also slightly dry and sarcastic about the way we're going on about her.
Yeah.
Maybe,
Yeah.
I don't know, Georgia, what do you think? I mean, I don't know how she handled oh, I know. When she had the show at Pat Hearn in New York, late in life, right, of her paintings, and it did well.
She was 70 years old when she had her first show in New York.
Yeah. And
1998.
And then Pat got sick, and Pat de Groot helped take care of Pat in Provincetown.
Mm-hmm.
She was on her way out.
That's right.
That show was quite well received, right? How did Pat respond to
she was
Pat
full
de Groot?
of herself.
But she wasn't like swell-headed about it.
Oh, yes, she was.
No, tell me, because she may have talked with you about it more than me. What did she say? Do you remember?
I won't say, but she was really, she grew 7 feet when she had that show.
And hey, audience.
As she should, you know.
It was very short.
Do you see her work in, especially with the 12 by 11s, in conversation with other artists? Did she see herself in dialogue with other artists, or do you as artists see these in broader conversations, formally, conceptually?
I don't think she felt any connection to other artists as far as her work was concerned. If you mentioned other artists to her, she was flattered if they were important artists, but she really had no truck with that.
I agree with that. I think it was work itself. It was her, the presence.
It was hers. It was hers only.
Well, she was her source, her influence that she was completely saturated with and plugged into, and her attention was on, her focus was on what she saw outdoors.
It was completely local and completely personal.
And very, it was from life, you know, as they say, it was from direct observation, and that was the activity. It wasn't a yeah, I get it. It wasn't like a dialogue with other people's art.
No, she had dialogues with her friends about art, but her art itself was not historical or in dialogue with, you know, painters past.
Right, or even, I mean, when she started oil painting, I'd been oil painting for a very long time already, and we talked about using the paint, but she wasn't, she'd been drawing for so long in that kind of independent, you know, practice. I don't like that term, but, you know, that activity was devout for her. It came from her Buddhism. It grew bigger than anything associated with any religion or anything except what she was looking at, in my opinion. But the way in which some people copy and worship other people's work, whether they're alive or dead, that just wasn't, I mean, I'm hearing this from all of us. I mean, she just looked out the window and that was it.
Yeah,
That's right. Yeah.
that's what she did.
Yeah, or she was outdoors looking, you know. How much did she oil paint outdoors, actually? I don't know.
She did not.
No, it was it was too messy outdoors. She drew a lot outdoors, but not that.
I think she did the birds from the tubes outdoors, but she didn't make these paintings, these small paintings outdoors at all.
But remember, her deck is right there on the bay.
She lived halfway out the door.
It's just window panes.
That's right.
Right. So it's like, you know, she was sheltered. She was in a tent outdoors, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Right out there. It's so, you know, in terms of oil paint is messy. You know, it's kind of a nightmare. You know, compared to ink or you know, painting at the end of an oil paint tube. It's you know, so you need the interior, but there's one thin scrim between her and the outside. You know, she may as well be painting outdoors. The outdoors is indoors in that house, actually. I mean, do you remember the number of times we were sitting at dinner and like the wind would be whistling through the windows and the rain would come through and the leaks in the house? You were basically in a boat, you know, in that house.
Yeah.
So you know, the idea that she should have been painting those or could have been painting those outsides. Look at where her painting is on that table right there, and the windows right there to the left of that painting propped up. So you know, she needs shelter so that the paint doesn't just get ruined. So those paintings were painted outdoors mentally, I think.
Kara, I'm going to have to go very shortly.
Oh. Sure. Georgia, did you have anything that we haven't been able to, for you to share?
No, I think everyone has been, you know, very able to really speak about Pat, describe who she was.
Well, you as well. We're really grateful that you were able to join us today. I know you had a very close relationship with Pat, and we're just really, really grateful for your sharing your perspective with us tonight.
Well, it was a pleasure to be here, and thank you for organizing this show. It really honors Pat and her work.
Thank you. That means a lot. I'll invite anyone in our audience who has any questions to please submit them into the Q&A if you haven't already. There is one from an audience member who's asking about sculptural work, and I know that she sculpted what became the headstone for Nanno's grave, but did she do any other sculptural work that you're aware of?
Not that
Not that I know of. No.
Me neither.
And that stone was the she'd never carved before that. And
Right.
it was an amazing achievement. Absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, you see it on the right, it's sort of going off the top of the picture. And one of us, Georgia,
Yeah.
actually, that Buddha was always in her garden. And,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, the house was sold before she died. Let's not go there. But Georgia went and got it and put it on her grave. And I just
Good.
want to thank Georgia for that.
I'm glad she did.
Can I do something that will take less than a minute and a half?
Mm-hmm.
In her garden, there were pansies, primroses, she loved primroses, 2 kinds of iris, tree peonies and herbaceous peonies. There was this enormous clump, like several clumps of pink peonies that bloomed on her birthday in June 14th. And there'd always be a really big bunch of them. Tulips, wisteria, sibirica, hyacinths, lilacs, roses. And indoors was there was a picture of it earlier, you couldn't really see, this enormous night blooming cereus.
Yeah. Yeah.
That took over the area over the table, sort of. And night blooming cereus, they bloom once or twice a year. And she'd always say, come over, it's blooming. And finally I went over, I was speechless, and I got a cutting and lived with one. I'm still living with one.
That smell.
Oh, the smell, it's like jungle fever. It's amazing. And she planted a linden tree when she bought, established the house, and the Buddha here is in the middle picture under it. But she had this cool thing. You'd walk in and the whole right side of the yard would be her vegetable garden, which became weedier. I used to go and do it for her when she got really old, a couple of times, 3 times. But the left side, the garden was flowers and groomed and lots of vegetables. And the left side was like totally wild, and it was very not Provincetown. I mean, when I say totally wild, I mean never mowed, high grass. And what it did was preserve this kind of eco climate right there on the water. The house was between the garden and the water, but a lot of things don't grow well in Provincetown because of the impact of the salt air and the wind. And that garden was like kind of a little oasis of greenery and high shade with black locust trees and the huge linden, which bloomed every spring. And it was extraordinary. And when I look over the fence now, I always tear up because it isn't quite like that anymore.
Nothing like that anymore. That garden is lush and wild and beautiful, and sustained so many meals. The kale, remember how lush the kale was almost year round?
Yeah.
God, I ate so much kale at Pat's house before kale was a thing. and it was
all that compost and eelgrass and marsh hay that made those gardens. Yeah.
It did.
Oh yeah. So you remember
she'd get the eelgrass, which is kind of very black and thick, and it's a really good soil amendment. And that's what Richard was describing,
right.
Heaving up from the beach, right? Yeah.
Oh, it's so hot. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, God.
It's
Well,
like
is there
black
nothing else from the
linguine.
audience, or have we,
Yes,
completely?
we have a few more questions that have come in. One is asking, how long did it take Pat to make a painting? And did she only use 12 by 11 surfaces? Essentially, could you talk more about her process and how she got to the 12 by 11s and once she started painting?
That's a good question because I never actually saw her paint. So I was not a witness to, she's kind of like Chardin. No one ever saw Chardin paint. I never saw her actively painting. So I don't know. Who knows how long it took? Does anyone here know? I think that's a mystery.
I
No.
know that you'd go back into it sometimes, but basically it would be, a lot done all at once, and sometimes that was enough, and sometimes she'd go back in. But the sizes, there were some smaller sizes. And you see here, there's some rectangles and then some squarish ones there, but they were all small, you know. See, I mean, now you can see the scale. Oh God, it's such a beautiful show. That's all I know. She never did a big, as far as I know, she never did a big painting.
No.
Yeah, and there was a lead in between when she first started using oils and doing the horizon, there were like these 14 by 14 pieces on linen where she was, trying to figure out what she was doing. And those are also beautiful. I think Paul has one. I have one.
Yeah.
I had one. But yeah.
And can you talk about
Yeah,
why she preferred panel?
Oh, that's easy. I know this. I paint on panels. I talked with her about it. I mean, to the point where she said, I get it. You can't, she was using a knife, but the thing about panels is they resist the mark. When you're, I use brushes. I very rarely use knives, palette knives. But if you're going to use a palette knife, it's not really great on canvas. Or, maybe it is. Maybe I just didn't have a good experience with it. But she liked that the panel resisted.
Yeah.
Well, Georgia earlier mentioned, the kind of the mystery and magic of how she used the palette knife to make really smooth blended surfaces. And on a linen canvas to do that, you would buckle that canvas. So she definitely needed the smoothness and the non-resistant, aspect of the wood to do that. Because otherwise, you'd just be pressing the linen into a saucer around the stretcher stick. So
yeah, something. So she didn't use brushes, but I gotta say, I don't know the answer to this, but to get that disc with that line,
God, I know.
she must have used a brush for that. You couldn't have done it.
I don't know.
I really don't know. I never saw brushes on her. Can we see some more studio shots? Is that easy for you, Cara?
Yeah.
Do we see any brushes? Oh, yes. Come on, guys. There are brushes right over there on the left. But I mean, generally, she just used the, that's one of Nanno's, that red sail one. She took a lot of photos also of her animals and other things and would send them to people. Like, see, okay, in this one on the left, above the dog, see the shape there? That's a Myron Stout, a postcard of a Myron Stout painting. Oh God, what about more questions?
We have one that's sort of following up on this question of her process, which is about were her paintings inspired by the rare visual events that she saw outside of her window, or the more regular events that sort of repeat in form? And I think we sort of see both, right? With these, you all who've witnessed the moon in Provincetown actually becoming this
Yeah,
color, right? Which is quite a
yeah.
phenomenon.
And sea smoke, which, you know, is a winter phenomena. And I'm not a meteorologist and I don't really understand how it goes, but it's like a billowing haze that you get on really incredibly cold days over the water.
Paul, it's not so much a haze. It actually, so I'm very sure about this because one of the few times I stayed with her in the middle of winter, I started 2 paintings, and one of them is called Sea Smoke. And you look at it, and it looks like somebody has actually lit a fire, like it's like from a direct source. It's not a haze. It looks like somebody's lit a fire on the surface of the water. It's crazy. And you know, of course, my landscape paintings are much more specific in, you know, my flat-footed way that I paint landscape. But it's weird. It really, I had never seen it before I saw it from her house. And then there are multiple fires lit in different spots all over the water.
But the answer, I think, to the question is that she painted both the everyday and the phenomenal. I mean, because that's living there every day.
Yeah, she had no problem doing this very kind of quotidian, like the one on the upper right. You know, it's not some kind of sensational thing. It's not a blizzard.
Mm-hmm.
It's just this kind of straight up, that's what the sky was doing and that's what the water was doing,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
And she seemed to sort of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like her practice was sort of defined by the seasons, right? She talks about going out in the kayak to the breakwater between September 1st and November. So, because it's not so busy with a lot of boats, but also it's not extremely hot and the sun isn't too bright to be out there for 6 hours. And then in the winter, when it's too cold to be outside, she would sort through all those drawings, put together these grids. And I wonder if her painting was also seasonal. I know the summertime in Provincetown is a very social season, a very busy season, but how the sort of social and natural forces were shaping when and how and where she was working.
I think that when she got to the panels, I think that it was all year long, because there are winter paintings that could only, like a winter storm, a snowstorm that could only happen, you know, during winter. I don't think that she actually curtailed her activity like she did earlier, because she didn't have to be out on the water. So, you know, she could keep observing from, again, her perch, you know, Helen, remembering her sitting on top of her perch as a bird, like, you know, her house was her perch. And the house is all about being able to witness all these things. Like, yeah, the one on the left, is that, yeah, that could be, that's not quite a winter painting, but it could be.
Fog, sea, and sand, it's called.
Yeah.
It could be summer. It could be,
but there's one really dark painting that has like, there's no light on the shore, and the yeah, is that one? Yeah, Winter Night. There it is, the center one. That center one that's definitely not a seasonal painting. I mean seasonal by being winter, but that means that she was painting through the winter. She's not making this up. She's seeing it. She's living it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, Georgia worked a lot from life and did extraordinary drawings. When I first met Georgia, she was doing these drawings of pine trees that were unbelievable. I mean, I was speechless the first time I saw them in her studio. But I think I'm the only one of us that has painted for years, not now, but for years in my life, directly from nature, you know, like she did. I would do some more things when I got the panels back to the studio. Like she would do it and then she'd do it some more right after doing it. so that she was still in the visual connection with it, even if it had gone by. Because the other thing she was unafraid of, and if you think about all the things we're talking about, life with animals, you know, karate, growing things, she was unafraid of what a lot of people can't handle about landscape, which is it's fugitive. You're looking at it and it's changing every minute. And she was fearless about that. And water, painting water, water does not sit still. You know, and the time, this wasn't fresh water. It was coming in and out. So she would be right there on it, like the athlete she was. You know, getting it right there with it.
And what do you think the horizon line means to her? I mean, sometimes they're completely obliterated. Sometimes they're high, sometimes they're low. And then also this sort of condensing of scale, right? We're talking about an expansive, endless sky and sea and horizon that she distills down into these smaller compositions.
I don't think there's any hidden meaning. It's just what she was looking at.
Yeah.
Are there other questions?
Do we have any other final questions from our audience? These are really great. That might be all that's coming in.
Well, 2 hours. Oh, yeah, that's her at one of her margarita parties, right?
We can end with a cheers with Pat.
See the blankets behind her knee under the staircase? That's where her dog would lie on the deck.
She had all these like these oriental carpets like along the deck outside. It's so funny because they would just get saturated and then dry up and get saturated and dry up.
Right.
But they were for splinters, you know?
Right. No, I know, but like
Yeah.
it's you know, who carpets their deck, right?
Not the people that are living there now, let me tell you.
Yeah.
Oh, God. Okay, well, Paul, Richard, Cara, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Yes,
and
nice
Clara
to
especially.
see your faces. Good to see your faces. Someday we'll all be together somewhere. I hope.
This has been a nice visit. Thank
I
you.
hope so.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And
Thanks.
again, the exhibition is on view until January 20th, 2025. And thank you all for joining, and Helen, Paul, Richard, and of course, Georgia for joining us this evening and sharing your thoughts about Pat and her work.
Thank
Really
you, Cara.
important, very special.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night.
Bye-bye.